Dr. Harrison, I'm a Harvard-trained nurse with honors. I'm more than qualified to assist in this procedure, Maya Johnson said, her voice steady despite the humiliation burning through her. Qualified? Dr. Harrison scoffed, eyeing her with contempt. People like you are only here because of quotas, not qualifications. Stick to changing bedpans where you belong. From his hospital bed, patient Victor Sullivan's eyes narrowed. Nobody noticed his hand reaching for his phone. Was Dr. Harrison right to put Maya in her place, or did he cross a line? Comment below with your thoughts. If you want to see how this privileged doctor gets what's coming to him when he discovers who Mr. Sullivan really is, like and subscribe now. The next part reveals a twist you won't believe. The pristine halls of Westlake Memorial Hospital gleamed under the fluorescent lights as Maya Johnson struggled to maintain her composure. The words Dr. Harrison had just hurled at her in front of patient Victor Sullivan still hung in the air, sharp and cutting. At 32, Maya had faced discrimination before, but never so blatantly in front of a patient. She took a deep breath, willing her voice to remain steady as she completed her report. Mr. Sullivan's vitals are stable. I've administered the prescribed medication and updated his chart accordingly. Dr. Harrison barely acknowledged her words with a dismissive nod before turning his attention to Mr. Sullivan, his demeanor transforming instantly into practiced charm. Mr. Sullivan, I apologize for that little disruption. Rest assured you're receiving the best care Westlake can provide. Is there anything else you need? Mr. Sullivan, a distinguished-looking man in his 60s with silver hair and penetrating eyes, simply stared at Dr. Harrison for an uncomfortable moment before responding. Actually, I'd prefer if Nurse Johnson continued to oversee my care. His voice was calm but carried an undeniable authority. She seems quite competent to me. A flicker of annoyance crossed Dr. Harrison's face before his professional mask slipped back into place. Of course, whatever makes you comfortable. Nurse Johnson will be available should you need anything. As they exited the room, Dr. Harrison grabbed Maya's arm roughly, pulling her aside in the hallway. Don't think this changes anything, he hissed, his voice low enough that only she could hear. One complaint from him and you'll be looking for another job. Remember your place. Maya gently but firmly removed his hand from her arm. My place is caring for patients with dignity and respect, Dr. Harrison. Something you might want to consider practicing yourself. She walked away, her head held high despite the trembling in her hands. This wasn't just her first month at Westlake Memorial. It was becoming a daily battle against prejudice and preconceptions. The nurse's station was buzzing with activity as Maya approached, but conversations dwindled to whispers when she arrived. She was accustomed to this by now. The sudden silence, the averted gazes, the subtle exclusion that was impossible to prove but impossible to ignore. Maya, called out Nurse Lisa Bennett, one of the few staff members who had shown her any kindness. Everything okay? You look shaken. Maya forced a smile. I'm fine, just another wonderful interaction with Dr. Harrison. Lisa's face clouded with sympathy. That man is a nightmare wrapped in an expensive suit. Don't let him get to you. Easier said than done when he's trying his hardest to get me fired, Maya replied, keeping her voice low. Well, he picked the wrong woman to mess with, didn't he? Lisa gave her a supportive smile. You didn't get through nursing school with honors by backing down from challenges. Maya appreciated Lisa's support, but they both knew the reality of their workplace. Dr. Richard Harrison wasn't just any doctor. He was chief of surgery, a major donor to the hospital, and came from a family with deep connections throughout the medical community. His power at Westlake was nearly absolute. As Maya updated patient charts, her mind drifted back to the conversation with her mother the night before. Mama, I don't know if I can do this, she had confessed, exhaustion evident in her voice. Every day it's something new. Every day it's something new. Yesterday, Dr. Harrison questioned my competence in front of the entire staff. Today, he assigned me the most difficult patients back to back. Her mother's voice had been strong and unwavering. Maya Elizabeth Johnson, you listen to me. You've worked too hard to let anyone make you feel less than. Remember who you are and where you come from. You're not just there for yourself. You're there for every little black girl who dreams of walking those halls one day. The memory gave Maya strength as she continued her rounds. Her next stop was room 305. Mr. Peterson, notorious among the nursing staff for his racist outbursts. She had already been assigned to him 3 times this week, while her white colleagues mysteriously avoided his room altogether. Taking a deep breath, Maya entered with a professional smile. "Good afternoon, Mr. Peterson. I'm here to check your vitals and change your dressing." Mr. Peterson's face contorted with disgust. "What are you doing here? I told them I don't want no colored nurse touching me." Maya had prepared herself for this reaction, but the words still stung. Maintaining her composure, she continued, "Mr. Peterson, I understand your concerns, but I assure you I'm fully qualified to provide your care." "I don't care how qualified you think you are," he spat. "Get me a real nurse, a white one." Despite the barrage of racial slurs that followed, Maya completed her tasks with precision and efficiency. Her hands remained steady, her voice calm. Years of facing discrimination had taught her to compartmentalize, to separate the hatred from the person who needed her professional care. When she finally emerged from the room, Maya found Dr. Harrison leaning against the wall outside, a look of faint concern on his face. "Everything all right in there, Nurse Johnson? We heard quite a commotion." The implication was clear. He had assigned her to Mr. Peterson, hoping she would fail, creating an excuse to question her abilities further. "Mr. Peterson's vitals are stable, and his dressing has been changed," Maya replied evenly. "Is there anything else you need from me, Dr. Harrison?" For a moment, surprise flickered across his face, quickly replaced by his usual mask of condescension. "Well, let's hope you can maintain that level of composure with all your patients. We wouldn't want any complaints now, would we?" As he walked away, Maya couldn't shake the feeling that she had just passed some sort of twisted test, one she should never have been subjected to in the first place. The rest of Maya's shift passed in a blur of endless tasks and subtle slights. She found herself constantly having to double-check her work, not because she doubted her abilities, but because she knew that even the smallest mistake would be magnified and used against her. By the time her shift ended, Maya was physically and emotionally drained. As she gathered her things from her locker, she overheard 2 nurses whispering nearby. "Can you believe they're making such a big deal about diversity hires?" one said, her voice dripping with disdain. "It's not like they can keep up with the rest of us anyway." Maya's hand froze on her locker door, her heart pounding in her chest. She wanted nothing more than to confront them, to defend herself and her abilities. But she knew any such confrontation would only serve to reinforce their prejudices. Instead, she quietly closed her locker and made her way out of the hospital, her head held high despite the weight of the day pressing down on her shoulders. As Maya waited at the bus stop, a sleek black Mercedes pulled up beside her. The window rolled down, revealing Dr. Harrison behind the wheel. "Nurse Johnson," he called out, his voice dripping with false concern. "Waiting for the bus again? Such a shame. Looks like that's all you can afford on a nurse's salary, isn't it?" Before Maya could respond, Dr. Harrison sped away, leaving her standing there, humiliated and angry. The casual cruelty of his words cut deep, reminding her once again of the uphill battle she faced every day at Westlake. As she boarded the bus, Maya's mind was a whirlwind of emotions. The excitement and hope she had felt when she first started at Westlake seemed like a distant memory now, replaced by a grim determination to survive in this hostile environment. But even as she grappled with the day's events, a small voice in the back of her mind whispered that something had to give. The question was, would she be the one to break under the constant pressure, or would her perseverance finally force a change in the toxic culture of Westlake Memorial? Little did Maya know that an unexpected ally was about to enter her life, one who would help tip the scales in her favor and expose the deep-seated prejudices that had long festered within the walls of Westlake Memorial Hospital. As the bus rumbled through the darkening streets, Maya closed her eyes, drawing strength from the memory of her mother's words and the legacy of resilience that ran through her veins. Tomorrow would be another battle, but she was determined to face it head-on, no matter what challenges lay ahead. The next morning, Maya arrived at Westlake with renewed determination. She had spent the night reflecting on her experiences and reminding herself of why she became a nurse in the first place: to help people, regardless of their background or her own challenges. As she made her way to the nurses' station, Maya noticed a flurry of activity. Nurses were hurriedly preparing a room, and there was an air of anticipation that she hadn't felt before. "What's going on?" Maya asked one of her colleagues, curious about the commotion. The nurse, momentarily forgetting her usual coolness toward Maya, replied excitedly, "We've got a VIP patient coming in. Some big shot who got into a skiing accident. Both arms broken, from what I heard." Before Maya could inquire further, Dr. Harrison appeared, his face set in a stern expression. "Nurse Johnson," he said, his voice clipped, "I need you to handle the new admission in room 412. Mr. Victor Sullivan. He's had a severe skiing accident, and both his arms are broken. I expect you to provide him with the utmost care and attention." Maya nodded, recognizing the assignment for what it was. "Another test. Of course, Dr. Harrison. I'll see to it right away." As she made her way to room 412, Maya couldn't shake the feeling that this assignment was different somehow. The air of importance surrounding this patient made her wonder if there was more to this situation than met the eye. Entering the room, Maya was greeted by the sight of the same middle-aged man she had met the day before, the one who had witnessed Dr. Harrison's humiliating comments. Both his arms were now properly cast. Despite his injuries, there was an air of quiet authority about Mr. Sullivan that Maya immediately noticed. "Good morning, Mr. Sullivan," she said, approaching the bed with a warm smile. "I'm Nurse Maya Johnson, and I'll be taking care of you during your stay with us." Mr. Sullivan looked up at her, his eyes sharp and assessing. "Good morning, Nurse Johnson," he replied, his voice surprisingly strong given his condition. "I appreciate your help. I must say, I didn't expect to see you again so soon after yesterday's interaction." As Maya began to check his vitals and assess his condition, she couldn't help but notice how Mr. Sullivan watched her every move with keen interest. Unlike many of the other patients she had dealt with, there was no hint of prejudice or disdain in his gaze, only a thoughtful curiosity. "You seem very competent, Nurse Johnson," Mr. Sullivan commented as she adjusted his IV. "How long have you been working at Westlake?" Maya paused, surprised by the genuine interest in his tone. "I've been here for about a month now, sir," she replied carefully. "It's been quite an experience so far." Mr. Sullivan raised an eyebrow at her diplomatic response. "I see," he said, a hint of amusement in his voice. "And how have you found the hospital? Living up to its prestigious reputation, I hope." Maya hesitated, unsure of how to answer. She was saved from responding by the arrival of Dr. Harrison, who burst into the room with an overly cheerful demeanor that Maya had never seen before. "Hannah Sullivan!" Dr. Harrison exclaimed, his voice dripping with false warmth. "I trust Nurse Johnson has been taking good care of you. We only assign our best staff to our most distinguished patients." Maya fought to keep her expression neutral, knowing full well that Dr. Harrison had never shown such faith in her abilities before. Mr. Sullivan, however, seemed to pick up on the inconsistency. "Indeed, Dr. Harrison," he replied, his eyes flicking between the doctor and Maya. "Nurse Johnson has been exemplary. I was just asking her about her experiences here at Westlake." Dr. Harrison's smile faltered for a moment before he quickly recovered. "Well, I'm sure she'll tell you it's been nothing short of excellent. We pride ourselves on our inclusive and supportive environment here at Westlake." Maya felt a surge of anger at Dr. Harrison's blatant hypocrisy, but she maintained her professional demeanor. Mr. Sullivan, however, seemed to sense the underlying tension. "Is that so?" he mused, his eyes never leaving Maya's face. "Well, I look forward to experiencing this supportive environment firsthand during my stay, especially after what I witnessed yesterday." The room fell silent. Dr. Harrison's smile froze on his face as he realized that Mr. Sullivan was referring to his earlier derogatory comments toward Maya. "I'm not sure what you mean, Mr. Sullivan," Dr. Harrison said, his voice strained. "I think you know exactly what I mean, Doctor," Mr. Sullivan replied calmly. "But we can discuss that later. Right now, I'd like to hear more about my treatment plan." As Dr. Harrison launched into a detailed explanation, Maya couldn't shake the feeling that she had just witnessed something significant. The way Mr. Sullivan had looked at her, the pointed nature of his questions, his veiled reference to yesterday's incident, it was as if he was seeing beyond the surface of Westlake's polished facade. When Dr. Harrison finally left, Mr. Sullivan turned his attention back to Maya. "Nurse Johnson," he said quietly, "I want you to know that I see what's happening here, and I don't approve." Maya felt a lump form in her throat, unexpectedly moved by this simple acknowledgement. For weeks, she had endured discrimination and microaggressions with no one in power willing to acknowledge it. Now, this stranger, this patient, was openly recognizing her struggle. "Thank you, Mr. Sullivan," she replied, her voice steady despite the emotion she felt. "But please, don't worry about me. My focus is on making sure you receive the best care possible during your stay." Mr. Sullivan smiled, a knowing look in his eyes. "Sometimes, Nurse Johnson, the people who deserve justice the most are the ones who ask for it the least. Remember that." As Maya left the room, she couldn't help but wonder who Victor Sullivan really was, and why he seemed so interested in her situation. Little did she know that their paths crossing would set in motion events that would change Westlake Memorial Hospital forever. Maya found herself returning to Mr. Sullivan's room more frequently over the next few days. Unlike her other assignments, these visits provided rare moments of respite from the increasingly hostile environment at Westlake. Mr. Sullivan was not only courteous, but genuinely interested in her perspective, something Maya had rarely experienced from patients. "Tell me, Nurse Johnson," Mr. Sullivan asked during one of her routine checks, "what made you choose nursing as a career?" Maya smiled as she adjusted his IV. "My grandmother was a nurse. She was one of the first black women to work at County General back in the 1960s. The story she told, both the challenges and the triumphs, inspired me." "She must have faced significant obstacles," Mr. Sullivan observed. "She did." Maya nodded, her eyes momentarily distant. "Which is why I find it so—" She paused, catching herself before saying something unprofessional. "Find it so what?" Mr. Sullivan pressed gently. Maya hesitated, disappointing that some attitudes haven't changed as much as we'd hope in all these years. Mr. Sullivan's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. "I suspect that's quite an understatement, given what I've observed here." Before Maya could respond, the door swung open and Dr. Harrison strode in, flanked by two men in expensive suits whom Maya had never seen before. "Mr. Sullivan," Dr. Harrison announced with practiced charm, "I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Philip Westbrook, our Chief of Medicine, and Mr. James Kavanaugh, Chairman of the Hospital Board. They wanted to personally ensure you're receiving our absolute best care." The two men approached the bed, seemingly oblivious to Maya's presence. Mr. Sullivan acknowledged them with a nod, but then deliberately turned to Maya. "Gentlemen, have you had the pleasure of meeting Nurse Johnson? She's been exemplary in her care." The two men turned, clearly surprised by Sullivan's focus on a nurse. Dr. Westbrook recovered first, offering a perfunctory smile. "Ah, yes. We're fortunate to have dedicated nursing staff." "More than dedicated," Sullivan pressed. "Nurse Johnson prevented a critical error during surgery yesterday, from what I understand." Maya froze, feeling Dr. Harrison's glare burning into her back. The room fell uncomfortably silent. "Is that so?" Mr. Kavanaugh asked, his interest suddenly piqued. Dr. Harrison laughed dismissively, a minor suggestion during a routine procedure. "Hardly worth mentioning." "That's not what I heard," Mr. Sullivan said calmly. "In fact, I understand it may have saved the patient's life." Maya stood quietly, her heart pounding as she became the center of unexpected attention. Dr. Westbrook looked between Sullivan and Harrison, clearly sensing tension. "Well," he said diplomatically, "we certainly encourage all our staff to speak up for patient safety. That's part of our excellence protocol." "Excellent on paper, perhaps," Sullivan remarked. "But does that match the reality, I wonder?" As the conversation shifted to Mr. Sullivan's treatment plan, Maya quietly excused herself, feeling Dr. Harrison's eyes follow her to the door. She knew that her already precarious position had just become even more dangerous. Later that afternoon, Maya was updating patient charts when Lisa approached, her expression worried, Maya, what happened with Sullivan? The whole hospital is buzzing. They're saying you contradicted Harrison during surgery, and now Sullivan is making waves about it. Maya sighed. I just suggested an alternative approach based on the patient's anatomy. It was the right call medically. I don't doubt, Lisa said, lowering her voice. But Harrison is on the warpath. He just spent 20 minutes in Westbrook's office, and he looked murderous when he came out. Great, Maya muttered, the weight of constant vigilance pressing down on her shoulders. Listen, Lisa continued, glancing around to ensure they weren't overheard. There's something else you should know. Sullivan isn't just some random vibe. Word is he's connected to MedCorp International. Maya's eyes widened. MedCorp was one of the largest healthcare conglomerates in the country, known for acquiring hospitals and healthcare systems. Are they looking to buy Westlake? She asked. Lisa shrugged. Nobody knows for sure, but the board has been panicking about funding. A buyout could solve their problems, or cost them their jobs, depending on how it goes. Either way, Harrison is under enormous pressure to keep Sullivan happy. This new information cast Sullivan's interest in her situation in a different light. Was he genuinely concerned about discrimination, or just gathering ammunition for a corporate takeover? Before Maya could ponder this further, her pager beeped urgently. Emergency in room 412, Sullivan's room. When Maya arrived, she found Mr. Sullivan experiencing severe chest pain. She immediately began assessment procedures as Dr. Harrison rushed in seconds later. What happened? He demanded, pushing past Maya to reach the patient. Sudden onset chest pain, elevated heart rate, Maya reported professionally. I've already called for an ECG and started oxygen. Dr. Harrison barely acknowledged her report as he began his own examination. When the ECG machine arrived, he turned to Maya with a dismissive wave. That will be all, Nurse Johnson. We'll take it from here. Maya hesitated, looking at Mr. Sullivan, whose eyes were fixed on her despite his pain. Actually, doctor, she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart, hospital protocol requires a nurse to remain present during emergency procedures. Dr. Harrison's face darkened. I said, we'll take it from here. And I'd prefer if Nurse Johnson stayed, Mr. Sullivan managed between labored breaths. The standoff lasted only seconds before Dr. Harrison grudgingly nodded. Throughout the next 30 minutes, Maya assisted as they determined Mr. Sullivan was experiencing complications from pain medication rather than a cardiac event. Throughout the emergency, Dr. Harrison acted as if Maya were invisible, speaking only to the other doctors who had joined them. When Mr. Sullivan was finally stabilized, and the room cleared except for Maya and Dr. Harrison, the doctor turned to her with cold fury. My office, now. The walk to Dr. Harrison's office felt like a march to the gallows. Maya kept her head high as she passed curious colleagues, their whispers following in her wake. Inside his immaculate office, Dr. Harrison closed the door with deliberate calm that was somehow more frightening than a slam would have been. You need to understand something, Nurse Johnson, he began, his voice dangerously soft. This hospital runs on hierarchy. It's not a democracy. When I give an order, you follow it. With all due respect, Dr. Harrison, Maya replied, working to keep her voice steady. I was following hospital protocol and the patient's expressed wishes. Don't hide behind protocol, he snapped. You've been undermining me since you arrived. The surgery, and now this. You're playing some kind of game, and I don't appreciate it. Maya felt her professional composure beginning to crack. This isn't a game to me, Dr. Harrison. This is my career. My calling. All I've done is provide proper care to my patients and advocate for their safety. What you've done, he said, moving closer, is repeatedly overstep your boundaries. Let me be perfectly clear. Your presence at Westlake was a diversity initiative pushed by the board, an experiment that, frankly, is failing. The blatant racism of his statement hit Maya like a physical blow. All the microaggressions, the unfair assignments, the whispers behind her back had been building to this moment, where Dr. Harrison felt comfortable enough to openly declare that her skills and qualifications meant nothing next to the color of her skin. My Harvard nursing degree and honors weren't a diversity initiative, Maya said, her voice trembling not with fear but with anger. My clinical excellence isn't an experiment, and the only failure here is a workplace that tolerates discrimination. Dr. Harrison's face flushed. You throw around that word so easily. Discrimination. It's the convenient excuse when you can't meet the standards required of you. The standards? Maya echoed incredulously. You assign me double the patient load of my white colleagues. You send me to the most difficult and abusive patients. You undermine me at every turn. Then you have the audacity to question my abilities. I question your attitude, Nurse Johnson. Your entitlement. Maya nearly laughed. Entitlement. To what? Equal treatment. Professional respect. Basic human dignity. To special consideration, Dr. Harrison countered. To advancement you haven't earned. The injustice of his words burned through Maya's remaining restraint. I have never asked for special consideration. Only the same opportunities and respect given to others. But clearly that's too much to ask in Dr. Harrison's Westlake. His eyes narrowed dangerously. Careful, Nurse Johnson. Very careful. One more step out of line, one more complaint, and you'll find yourself without a job. And with my recommendation, you'll be lucky to find work at a walk-in clinic. The threat hung in the air between them. Maya knew it wasn't empty. Harrison had the power and connections to seriously damage her career. But in that moment, standing before the embodiment of the discrimination she'd faced her entire life, Maya found a wellspring of courage she didn't know she possessed. Is that what you told my grandmother's generation, Dr. Harrison? That they should be grateful for whatever scraps they were thrown? That demanding dignity was stepping out of line? Maya straightened to her full height. I won't be intimidated into silence. Not by you, not by anyone. Dr. Harrison stared at her, seemingly stunned by her defiance. Then his expression hardened. You have 2 weeks to find another position, Nurse Johnson. I'll be recommending your termination to the board at their next meeting. Is Maya fighting a losing battle against a system designed to protect people like Dr. Harrison? Or will the mysterious Mr. Sullivan turn the tables? Comment below with your predictions, and don't forget to like and subscribe to find out what happens next. Maya left Dr. Harrison's office with her head high, but her heart racing. She had just effectively been given notice that her career at Westlake, possibly her entire nursing career, was in jeopardy. As she walked through the hospital corridors, the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. She found herself in an empty supply room, finally allowing the tears she'd been holding back to fall. Her hands shook as she pulled out her phone, dialing her mother's number. "Baby girl," her mother answered, immediately sensing something was wrong. "What happened?" "I think I just got fired, Mama," Maya said, her voice breaking. "Or I will be, in 2 weeks." As Maya recounted the confrontation with Dr. Harrison, her mother listened silently. When she finished, the pause on the other end of the line stretched long enough that Maya wondered if the call had dropped. "Mama, I'm here," her mother finally replied, her voice resolute. "And I'm proud of you, Maya Elizabeth Johnson. You stood your ground when it would have been easier to bow your head. But what good did it do? I'm losing my job. He wins." "He only wins if you believe he does," her mother stated firmly. "Your grandmother faced worse, and she didn't give up. Neither will you." After the call, Maya splashed cold water on her face in the bathroom and returned to her duties. She had patients who needed her, regardless of the personal crisis unfolding in her professional life. When she entered Mr. Sullivan's room for his evening medication, he immediately sensed something was wrong. "You've been crying," he observed quietly. Maya fought to maintain her professional demeanor. "I'm fine, Mr. Sullivan. Just a difficult day." Sullivan studied her face for a long moment. "Dr. Harrison threatened your job, didn't he?" Maya looked up, startled. "How did you—" "I've spent my life reading people, Nurse Johnson. It's served me well in business." He'd adjusted himself in the bed with a wince. "Tell me what happened." "The full story, please." Against her better judgment, Maya found herself recounting the confrontation. Something about Sullivan's focused attention made her feel she could trust him with the truth. 2 weeks, he mused when she finished. "Interesting timing." "What do you mean?" "The hospital board votes on the potential MedCorp acquisition in 10 days, Sullivan explained. "Harrison is trying to remove what he perceives as a problem before then. Maya frowned. But why would my presence affect the acquisition? Sullivan's expression became unreadable. Perhaps it wouldn't. Or perhaps it would raise uncomfortable questions about the hospital's culture. Before Maya could press further, the door opened and Lisa poked her head in. Maya, sorry to interrupt, but there's an issue with Mr. Peterson. He's refusing his medication from anyone but you. Maya excused herself, puzzled. Mr. Peterson, the openly racist patient, was specifically asking for her. It made no sense. When she arrived at his room, Mr. Peterson was sitting up in bed, looking uncomfortable, but less hostile than usual. Mr. Peterson, Maya greeted him professionally. You wanted to see me. He avoided her eyes, fidgeting with his blanket. Heard you're the one who saved that guy in surgery yesterday. The other nurses are talking about it. I just suggested an alternative approach, Maya said carefully. Mr. Peterson finally looked at her, his expression conflicted. My wife died 3 years ago. Bad surgery. Doctor wouldn't listen to the nurse who said something wasn't right. He swallowed hard. Maybe if our doctor had listened like that surgeon listened to you, she'd still be here. Maya was stunned by this unexpected revelation. I'm sorry about your wife, Mr. Peterson. He shrugged, clearly uncomfortable with the vulnerability he'd shown. Just wanted someone competent giving me my meds, that's all. Don't make a big deal of it. As Maya administered his medication, she reflected on how easily the hospital staff, herself included, had written Mr. Peterson off as simply a racist old man. His behavior was still inexcusable, but there were layers to his story she hadn't considered. The next morning, Maya arrived to find the hospital abuzz with news. Overnight, Mr. Sullivan had experienced complications requiring emergency intervention, and Dr. Harrison, who was on call, had not responded to his page for nearly 40 minutes. By the time he arrived, the on-duty resident had already stabilized the patient. Now Mr. Sullivan was demanding a different attending physician, and the hospital administration was in chaos. He specifically asked for you to be his primary nurse moving forward, Lisa told Maya as they prepared medications. Westbrook is freaking out, and Harrison is on the warpath, but I'm supposed to be gone in 2 weeks, Maya said. Lisa raised her eyebrows. Apparently, Sullivan threatened to contact the MedCorp CEO directly if they removed you from his care. Nobody's touching your job right now. Throughout the day, Maya felt the shifting dynamics of the hospital. Nurses who had previously avoided her now offered tentative smiles. Dr. Westbrook himself stopped her in the hallway to ask about Sullivan's care preferences. Even some of the senior staff who had aligned with Harrison seemed to be reconsidering their positions. When Maya entered Sullivan's room that afternoon, she found him looking much better than she'd expected after his night's ordeal. Mr. Sullivan, how are you feeling? She asked, checking his vitals. Much improved now that I don't have to worry about Dr. Harrison's delayed responses, he replied dryly, though I'm curious why the chief of surgery was so slow to respond to an emergency with a VIP patient. Maya focused on adjusting his IV, saying, Nothing. You know, don't you? Sullivan pressed. After a moment's hesitation, Maya spoke quietly. There was a staff party at his country club last night. I wasn't invited, of course, but I heard it mentioned. If he was drinking. Sullivan nodded thoughtfully. Interesting that a surgeon on call would attend such an event. One might question his judgment. One might, Maya agreed carefully, if one had the power to make such questions matter. Sullivan smiled. Power is a curious thing, Nurse Johnson. It's not always about titles or positions. Sometimes it's about having the right information at the right time. He gestured to the chair beside his bed. Sit with me a moment if you have time. I'd like to tell you a story. As Maya sat, Sullivan began speaking in a lower voice. 20 years ago, I was a hospital administrator in Chicago. Young, ambitious, convinced I knew everything. There was a nurse on staff, older black woman. Reminded me of how you described your grandmother. She filed a complaint about discriminatory treatment from one of our star surgeons. Maya felt a chill of recognition. I dismissed her concerns, Sullivan continued. Regret evident in his voice. Told myself she was being oversensitive, that our surgeon was just demanding, not discriminatory. I protected the hospital's image instead of investigating properly." He paused. 6 months later, that surgeon made a critical error that cost a patient's life. An error that same nurse had previously warned about, but was ignored. The investigation revealed a pattern of dismissing concerns from minority staff. "What happened?" Maya asked quietly. "The hospital was sued. The surgeon lost his license. I lost my job." Sullivan met her eyes directly. "But more importantly, a patient lost their life because I failed to recognize that discrimination isn't just morally wrong. It's dangerous. When we silence voices because of who's speaking rather than what they're saying, we put everyone at risk." The weight of his words hung in the room. Maya understood now why Sullivan had taken such an interest in her situation. "The board meeting is in 8 days, Sullivan said after a moment. "I'd like you to prepare something for me by then, if you're willing." "What kind of something?" Maya asked cautiously. "Documentation. Every incident of discriminatory treatment you've experienced or witnessed. Names, dates, contexts, as specific and detailed as possible." Maya hesitated. "Mr. Sullivan, I appreciate your support, but I'm just trying to do my job. I don't want to become the center of some hospital scandal." "Sometimes, Nurse Johnson, doing your job properly requires challenging the systems that prevent you from doing it." Sullivan's expression was serious. "This isn't just about you. It's about every patient who might suffer because valuable voices are being silenced." As Maya left Sullivan's room, her mind was racing. His request was reasonable, even necessary, but the potential consequences terrified her. Taking a stand might not just cost her this job. It could label her a troublemaker throughout the industry. That evening, as Maya was preparing to leave, she was surprised to see Dr. Westbrook approaching her. "Nurse Johnson, a word," he requested, gesturing to a nearby consultation room. Inside, his expression was grave. "I understand there have been some tensions between you and Dr. Harrison." Maya kept her response measured. "We have different approaches to patient care, yes." Dr. Westbrook nodded slowly. "Mr. Sullivan speaks very highly of you. That carries significant weight given the current discussions with MedCorp. I'm just doing my job, sir." "Perhaps." He studied her for a moment. "But I'm curious. If you were in my position, how would you address the concerns that have been raised about our hospital culture?" The question caught Maya off guard. Was this a genuine inquiry or a trap? "I believe I would start by acknowledging there might be a problem," she said carefully. "Cultural issues don't develop overnight, and they can't be solved with a single diversity training session or policy change. What would you suggest instead?" He pressed. Maya took a deep breath, deciding to offer her honest assessment. A thorough, independent review of hiring practices, advancement opportunities, and complaint procedures. Anonymous surveys of minority staff members. And most importantly, real consequences for discriminatory behavior, regardless of someone's position or tenure. Dr. Westbrook's expression revealed nothing. "Thank you for your candor, Nurse Johnson. That will be all for now." As she left the hospital that night, Maya felt caught in a swirling current of hospital politics and corporate maneuvering. Her simple desire to be treated fairly as a nurse had somehow placed her at the center of forces much larger than herself. What she didn't know was that the confrontation brewing between Dr. Harrison, Mr. Sullivan, and the hospital leadership would soon come to a head, with consequences none of them could fully anticipate. The day of the hospital board meeting arrived with a tension that seemed to electrify the very air of Westlake Memorial. As Maya prepared for her shift, she found herself the subject of whispered conversations and curious glances. Word had spread that Mr. Sullivan had requested her presence at the meeting, an unprecedented move for a nurse at her level. "Are you ready?" Lisa asked, finding Maya in the locker room. "Everyone's talking about the meeting." "Everyone's talking about the meeting." Maya took a deep breath, smoothing down her scrubs. "Ready as I'll ever be. I still don't know exactly what Mr. Sullivan has planned." The documentation he had requested was tucked safely in her bag, a meticulous record of every incident of discrimination she had experienced or witnessed during her time at Westlake. It had been emotionally exhausting to compile, forcing her to relive moments she would rather forget, but Sullivan had insisted on its importance. "Whatever happens, I've got your back," Lisa assured her. "And I'm not the only one. You've got more allies here than you realize." As Maya made her rounds that morning, she couldn't help but notice the shifting dynamics within the hospital. Staff members who had previously ignored her now offered smiles and words of encouragement. Even some of Dr. Harrison's closest colleagues seemed to be distancing themselves from him. When Maya checked on Mr. Sullivan, she found him dressed in a tailored suit despite his casts, looking more like an executive than a patient. "The big day has arrived, Nurse Johnson," he said with a grim smile. "Did you bring the documentation?" Maya nodded, handing him the folder. "Everything's there. But Mr. Sullivan, I'm still not sure what you're planning to do with it." Sullivan tucked the folder into his briefcase. "Sometimes, Maya, the most effective way to create change is to shine a light on what people would prefer to keep hidden." He glanced at his watch. "The board meeting begins in an hour. I've arranged for your supervisor to release you from your duties so you can attend." Maya's heart raced. "You want me at the board meeting?" "Not just present," Sullivan clarified. "I want you to speak. These people need to hear directly from someone who has experienced the discrimination that's been allowed to fester at Westlake." The thought of addressing the hospital board, particularly with Dr. Harrison present, made Maya's stomach churn. "I don't know if I can—" "You can," Sullivan interrupted gently. "More importantly, you must. Not just for yourself, but for everyone who comes after you. Remember what you told me about your grandmother, the battles she fought so you could be here?" Maya nodded, drawing strength from the memory of her grandmother's determination. "This is your chance to do the same for the next generation," Sullivan continued, "to ensure they face fewer barriers than you did." As they made their way to the boardroom, Maya's mind raced with everything she wanted to say, and everything she feared saying. When they arrived, the large conference room was already filled with board members, administrators, and key department heads. Dr. Harrison sat near the front, his face a mask of professional detachment that slipped momentarily when he spotted Maya entering alongside Sullivan. Dr. Westbrook approached them immediately. "Mr. Sullivan, we've arranged a seat for you at the table. Nurse Johnson, there's space in the observation area." "Nurse Johnson will be sitting beside me," Sullivan stated firmly. "In fact, her input will be central to what I have to say today." Whispers rippled through the room as Maya took a seat next to Sullivan at the massive oak table. She could feel Dr. Harrison's eyes boring into her from across the room, but she kept her gaze forward, determined not to be intimidated. Chairman Kavanaugh called the meeting to order, his voice echoing in the suddenly silent room. "Before we address the proposed acquisition by MedCorp International, Mr. Sullivan has requested time to address the board on a matter of urgent importance." Sullivan rose, his presence commanding immediate attention despite his injured arms. "Thank you, Chairman Kavanaugh. Ladies and gentlemen of the board, I come before you today not just as a potential investor, but as someone deeply concerned about the future of healthcare in this community." He paused, his gaze sweeping the room. "During my stay at Westlake, I've had the opportunity to observe this institution from a unique perspective. As a patient, what I've witnessed has been deeply troubling." The room tensed as Sullivan continued. "Beneath the surface of Westlake's reputation for excellence lies a culture of discrimination that not only harms your staff, but compromises patient care. I've documented numerous instances where qualified professionals, particularly minorities, have been undermined, overlooked, and openly discriminated against." Dr. Harrison shifted in his seat, his face reddening. Sullivan noticed and turned directly to him. "Dr. Harrison, your behavior toward Nurse Johnson and other minority staff members represents the most egregious example of this toxic culture. Your pattern of assigning excessive workloads, publicly questioning competence without basis, and making overtly discriminatory comments should have resulted in disciplinary action long ago." The room fell silent as Sullivan opened his briefcase and removed Maya's documentation. "I have here detailed accounts of discriminatory incidents occurring over just the past month. They paint a disturbing picture of institutional racism that the board can no longer ignore. Chairman Kavanaugh cleared his throat uncomfortably. Mr. Sullivan, while we appreciate your concerns, I'm not sure this is the appropriate forum. With all due respect, Chairman, if not here, then where? Sullivan countered. When discrimination is embedded in an institution's culture, addressing it must become the highest priority of leadership. Sullivan turned to Maya. Nurse Johnson has agreed to share her first-hand experiences. I urge you all to listen carefully, not just to the facts she presents, but to what they reveal about the environment you've allowed to develop at Westlake. As Maya stood, she felt a momentary wave of panic. Then she remembered her grandmother, her mother, and all those who had fought to create space for her in these halls. She took a deep breath and began to speak. I came to Westlake Memorial with honors from Harvard Nursing, eager to contribute to an institution known for excellence, she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. Instead, I found a workplace where my qualifications were constantly questioned, where I was assigned the most difficult patients and double the workload of my white colleagues, and where speaking up about patient safety was met with threats to my career. Maya described specific incidents, the consistent assignment of racist patients to her care, Dr. Harrison's public humiliation tactics, the whispered comments, the exclusion from professional development opportunities. She spoke without bitterness but with unflinching clarity, making it impossible for anyone in the room to dismiss her experiences as misinterpretations or oversensitivity. The most troubling aspect, she concluded, is that this discrimination doesn't just harm staff, it endangers patients. When qualified professionals are silenced because of who they are rather than what they know, we create an environment where errors go uncorrected and patient safety is compromised. I witnessed this firsthand during the surgery where Dr. Harrison nearly made a critical error, an error I hesitated to point out because of the consistent retaliation I'd faced for speaking up. The room was completely silent when Maya finished. Even Dr. Harrison seemed unable to muster his usual defense. Sullivan rose again. What Nurse Johnson has described is not unique to her experience. I've spoken with other minority staff members who shared similar stories, but feared coming forward. He fixed the board with a determined gaze. As you know, MedCorp has been considering acquiring Westlake Memorial. What you may not know is that I'm not just connected to MedCorp. I am MedCorp. Gasps and murmurs filled the room as Sullivan continued. My skiing accident was genuine, but my presence here has served a dual purpose: to evaluate Westlake as a potential acquisition and to assess its organizational culture firsthand. He placed his hands on the table, leaning forward to emphasize his next words. I cannot in good conscience recommend acquiring an institution with such deeply rooted cultural problems, unless there is immediate and meaningful commitment to change. The shock in the room was palpable. Chairman Kavanaugh was the first to recover. Mr. Sullivan, I assure you the board takes these concerns very seriously. We had no idea. That's precisely the problem, Sullivan interrupted. Leadership should know. When you don't, it's because you've created an environment where people fear speaking up. That must change. Dr. Harrison finally found his voice. This is preposterous. One nurse's subjective complaints are hardly evidence of systemic discrimination. Nurse Johnson has consistently demonstrated an inability to handle criticism and a tendency to interpret normal professional standards as discriminatory treatment. That's enough, Dr. Harrison, Dr. Westbrook interrupted, surprising everyone. I've reviewed Nurse Johnson's documentation myself, and it's consistent with patterns I've observed but failed to address. She's not alone in her experiences, and it's time we acknowledge that. Dr. Westbrook turned to face the board. As Chief of Medicine, I bear responsibility for allowing this culture to develop. I've been too focused on Westlake's reputation and not enough on the experience of everyone who works here. He took a deep breath. I recommend we accept Mr. Sullivan's conditions for acquisition and commit to the cultural changes he's proposing. What followed was an intense discussion as board members grappled with the revelations. Some defended the status quo, while others acknowledged the moral and legal imperative to address discrimination. Throughout it all, Maya sat quietly beside Sullivan, drawing strength from his unwavering support and her own conviction that she was fighting not just for herself, but for everyone who would come after her. Finally, Chairman Kavanaugh called for a vote. The board voted overwhelmingly to accept Sullivan's conditions, which included a complete overhaul of the hospital's anti-discrimination policies, mandatory training for all staff, an independent review of hiring and promotion practices, and immediate disciplinary action for Dr. Harrison. As the meeting concluded, Dr. Harrison approached Maya, his face a mask of barely contained fury. "You've made a powerful enemy today, Nurse Johnson. My connections in the medical community extend far beyond Westlake." Before Maya could respond, Sullivan stepped between them. "Dr. Harrison, threats of retaliation against Nurse Johnson will only compound your current difficulties. I suggest you reconsider your approach." Dr. Harrison glared at them both before storming out of the boardroom. As the room emptied, Sullivan turned to Maya with a smile. "Well done. That took tremendous courage." "I'm still processing what just happened," Maya admitted. "You're the CEO of MedCorp. Why didn't you tell me?" Sullivan's expression turned thoughtful. "Would it have changed how you interacted with me? Would you have shared your genuine experiences if you'd known my position from the beginning?" Maya considered this. "Probably not. I would have been too afraid of repercussions." "Exactly." Sullivan nodded. "I needed to see Westlake as it truly is, not as it would present itself to a potential buyer. And what I saw convinced me that change was necessary, not just here, but throughout our healthcare system." In the days that followed, Westlake Memorial underwent seismic changes. Dr. Harrison was placed on administrative leave pending a formal investigation. Dr. Westbrook issued a public apology, acknowledging the hospital's failure to address discrimination, and committed to implementing a comprehensive plan for cultural transformation. Most surprisingly to Maya, she was offered a newly created position, Director of Workplace Culture and Inclusion. The role would give her authority to implement changes, develop training programs, and create reporting systems to address discrimination before it became entrenched. A week after the board meeting, Maya met with Sullivan in his private room as he prepared for discharge. "I've been thinking about your offer," she told him. "The director position." Sullivan looked up from the paperwork he was signing. "I'm going to accept it," Maya said, a new confidence in her voice. "But I have conditions of my own." Sullivan raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "I'm listening." "First, I want full autonomy to implement changes without interference from the old guard. Second, I want resources to create a mentorship program for minority healthcare workers. And third, I want this initiative extended to all hospitals in the MedCorp network, not just Westlake." Sullivan smiled broadly. As they finalized the details, Maya couldn't help but reflect on how dramatically her life had changed in such a short time. From feeling isolated and on the verge of giving up, she now stood at the forefront of a movement with the potential to transform not just Westlake but healthcare institutions across the country. 1 year later, Maya stood before a packed auditorium at the National Healthcare Diversity Conference. The transformations at Westlake had gained national attention, and hospitals across the country were looking to implement similar changes. "A year ago," Maya began, "I was a nurse on the verge of giving up. Today I stand before you as living proof that change is possible, that one voice can make a difference." She shared Westlake's story of transformation, not shying away from the challenges they had faced, but also highlighting the victories, the increased diversity in leadership positions, the improved patient outcomes in units with diverse staff, the creation of safe reporting mechanisms that had uncovered and addressed discrimination before it became entrenched. "The journey hasn't been easy," Maya acknowledged. "Change never is. There were moments of backlash, resistance, and doubt. There were times when it would have been easier to retreat into silence, to accept discrimination as just the way things are. But that path leads only to perpetuating the same broken systems for the next generation." Maya paused, looking out at the sea of faces before her. "What I've learned through this experience is that addressing discrimination isn't just about fighting wrongs. It's about creating systems where everyone can thrive. It's about recognizing that diversity isn't just a buzzword or a quota to fill. It's a crucial element of excellence in healthcare. When we silence voices because of who's speaking rather than what they're saying, we don't just harm those individuals. We deprive ourselves and our patients of their valuable perspectives. Every time a qualified professional is overlooked, undermined, or pushed out because of discrimination, we lose potential innovations, insights, and improvements to patient care. She continued, her voice gaining strength. True change requires more than just diversity initiatives or inclusion statements. It requires courage, the courage to speak up when it would be easier to stay silent, the courage to listen when defensiveness feels more comfortable, and the courage to acknowledge systemic problems rather than dismissing them as isolated incidents. But most importantly, Maya emphasized, it requires recognition that this work is never truly finished. Creating an equitable workplace isn't a destination we arrive at once and for all. It's an ongoing commitment to examining our practices, our biases, and our systems with honesty and humility. As Maya concluded her speech, the audience rose in a standing ovation. Among them was Victor Sullivan, now fully recovered from his injuries, applauding with genuine pride. After the conference, Sullivan approached her with a warm smile. "Maya," he greeted her, "you've come a long way from the nurse I met a year ago." They discussed the progress at Westlake and its ripple effects across the healthcare industry. Sullivan shared that several other hospitals in the MedCorp network had begun implementing similar programs based on Westlake's success. "You know, Maya," Sullivan said thoughtfully, "when I checked into Westlake after my skiing accident, I never could have imagined the journey it would set in motion. You've not only transformed Westlake, but reignited my own passion for this work." As Maya prepared to return to Westlake, she reflected on her incredible journey. From an isolated, frustrated nurse to a leader and changemaker, she had come so far. The work was far from over, but Maya felt a sense of hope and determination stronger than ever before. Arriving back at Westlake, Maya was greeted by Lisa, once her only ally, now the head of nursing education. "Welcome back, Director Johnson," Lisa said with a grin. "The place isn't the same without you." The hospital buzzed with new energy, staff members collaborating and communicating in ways they never had before. In the main lobby, Maya paused before a new mural depicting a diverse group of healthcare professionals working together. A plaque below read, "Diversity is our strength. Inclusion is our commitment. Compassion is our calling." As she settled into her office, ready to tackle new challenges, Maya smiled. The transformation of Westlake was just the beginning. The real work of changing hearts, minds, and entire systems was ongoing, and she was ready for it all, committed to fighting for a truly inclusive healthcare system, one day at a time. Meanwhile, across town, Dr. Harrison sat in a small clinic office, his once prestigious career in tatters. The investigation had revealed a pattern of discrimination spanning years, making him virtually unhireable at any major hospital. As he treated patients in the walk-in clinic, the only position he could secure, he had time to reflect on how his own prejudice had ultimately been his downfall. Back at Westlake, Maya received an unexpected visitor late one afternoon. Mr. Peterson, the once openly racist patient who had been a source of such difficulty during her early days. "Nurse Johnson," he greeted her awkwardly. "Or, I guess it's Director Johnson now." Maya smiled. "Hello, Mr. Peterson. How can I help you?" He shifted uncomfortably. "I wanted to thank you. My granddaughter just got accepted to nursing school. She's always wanted to be a nurse, but didn't think she could make it." He paused. "She's black, like you. Seeing what you've done here, it gave her hope that she could do it too." As Mr. Peterson left, Maya felt the full weight of what they had accomplished. This wasn't just about policies or procedures. It was about creating possibilities for people who had been told, in countless ways both subtle and overt, that they didn't belong. The path forward would not be easy. There would be setbacks and resistance, moments of frustration and doubt. But Maya knew now that she was not alone in this fight, and that together, they could create lasting change, not just at Westlake, but throughout the healthcare system and beyond. Thank you for joining Maya on her journey from discrimination to transformation. Has her story inspired you to speak up against injustice in your own life? Share your thoughts in the comments below, And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that illuminate difficult truths and celebrate the power of courage in the face of adversity.